Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandham at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. On November 21st, 1980, 350 million people around the world tuned in to see Who Shot JR on the TV show Dallas after the show left off 8 months earlier with one of the most famous cliffhangers in TV history. In this same year, this week's guest won the Missouri Sports Writer of the Year Award, and the connection for this week's guest is he spent the majority of his career in the city of Dallas.
Welcome to the Football History Dude Podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time we step off the DeLorean. The date is November 21st, 1980, and we're sitting in front of the TV with 350 million other people around the world to find out who shot J.R. Ewing. A spoiler alert, we find out in that episode that it was Kristen Shepard, J.R.'s wife's sister. But what does this TV show have to do anything with the Football History Dude? Well, it doesn't really directly have anything to do with it, but indirectly it does, because this week's guest spent a long time in Dallas, covering not only the Cowboys but the entire NFL, working his way into becoming a Hall of Fame voter. This week's guest is Rick Gosselin, and here's his bio from the Talk of Fame Network site. Rick Gosselin has covered the NFL for 47 years and serves as the Hall of Fame Selection Committee plus both the contributor and senior subcommittees. He has covered the Lions, Giants, Chiefs, and Cowboys in his career, and in 2004 was awarded the Dick McCann Award for long and distinguished reporting on the NFL. Gosselin was the 1980 Missouri Sports Writer of the Year. And you'll learn much more about Rick and his career in this episode, but to get even more about him and the topics that we cover in the episode, I highly recommend that you head over to the website and take a look. You can get to the website through your podcast player or by heading straight to the website over at sportshistorynetwork.com, the headquarters for sports yesteryear. Also, while you're at it, I ask that you please subscribe for free to the show by mashing that little subscribe button in your podcast player choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest off the press episodes, each and every week. But for now, let's get into the interview with Rick Gosselin. And like I said, you worked at the Dallas Morning News for a very long time. I saw this article, the Swan Song article. But let's go before the Dallas Morning News. Let's go way back to the beginning of your career and, coming fresh out of college and starting off in your sports career. Let's take us back there. How did that go, Rick?
Yeah, I went to high school in Detroit at a little school called St. Ambrose. And this was a Catholic League power back then. And the school only had 360 kids, half of them were girls. But the hook was that during a 9-year period, they won 5 city titles and 4 state titles. And the first 2 coaches went on to win a combined 6 Super Bowl rings. Tom Boyce, who became personnel director of the New York Giants, and George Perlis, who became defensive coordinator for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So football is kind of in my blood from early on, from high school on. I went to Michigan State. I played hockey in high school. I had a chance. I could have walked on in hockey or gotten into my chosen field, which was writing, sports writing. I figured I had a better future as a writer than I did as a hockey player, as an American hockey player, I should say. So I went to work for the student paper my first term. And by my sophomore year, I was sports editor. My junior year, I won the inaugural Bill Reed Award as a top student sports writer in the Big Ten. I graduated early. I went 9 straight terms, got out in December, and went to work for UPI as a city side reporter out of college, but I was the backup sports guy. Richard Shuck was the lead sports writer, and I covered some Lions, covered some Tigers, covered some Pistons, Red Wings, all the sports. They knew I wanted to go into sports full time, so after 2 years, I transferred to New York City, and I became the NFC coordinator, I should say. I covered the Giants and coordinated UPI's NFC coverage. The Giants were terrible. Bill Arnsparger was the coach. He got fired, and they were terrible. I covered the 1 year they played in Shea and the first year at the Meadowlands. If you're going to live in New York City, you want to live in Manhattan, and I didn't. I lived in Forest Hills, and you really defeat the purpose. If you're not making enough money to live in Manhattan, you almost shouldn't be in New York. So I transferred to Kansas City, where I became the full-time sports editor. I covered everything. I covered Chiefs, Royals, Big Eight, NC Kings basketball. The NCAA was headquartered there. The National High School Federation was headquartered there. When I covered the Big Eight, I'd go on the Big Eight Sky Raiders every year, and I covered a Saturday football game every fall. And I covered the Chiefs the following day. I also covered the Royals during their 2 World Series from 80 and 85. Well, when I covered the Big Eight in the late 70s and into the 80s, I got to meet Jimmy Johnson, who was the new coach at Oklahoma State, his staff, Butch Davis, Tony Wise, Dave Wanstead. And those guys I would later reconnect with when I was hired to cover the Cowboys. So when I'm in Kansas City, I was there for 13 years, covered the Chiefs 13 years. I moved to Kansas City Star in 1985 as the primary Chiefs writer. 13 years, I covered 1 playoff game. Terrible football team, but it was the best thing that could have happened in my career because they were changing coaches every 3 years and they were bringing in new assistants. So I got to know virtually every assistant coach in the NFL during that 13-year period. So I had a pretty good network of sources. So my last year in Kansas City, 1989, the Dallas Morning News called up and wanted to know if I had an interest. Initially, I told them no. I mean, I was the primary beat guy at Kansas City Chiefs, one newspaper town. And then Tracy Ringlesby, a Hall of Fame baseball writer, one of my best friends, called me and said, look, I work for the Kansas City Star, or I work for the Dallas Morning News. You might want to rethink this. So I did, went for the interview, took the job. And I think one of the reasons they hired me is that I knew Jimmy Johnson and that staff. I walked into that building in 1990 with as good or better sources than the people that had been on the beat for a year. After 2 years, they realized that I knew more people around the league than the Cowboys guy did, or than the NFL guy did, so they flipped us. They put Tim Cowlishaw on the Cowboys and put me in the NFL. And for the next 20 years, I had the best job in America. I covered whatever game I wanted as long as it wasn't the Cowboys. So I covered the best game of the week. I covered the 49ers and the Bills in the early 90s. I covered the Packers and the Broncos in the late 90s. I covered the Patriots, Colts in that 2000 run. I saw a good football game every week. And then in 2011, the Morning News made me a sports columnist. And then I went back to seeing every Cowboy game. And that's it takes you through 48 years of NFL coverage.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot. And like you said, moving from Kansas City to Dallas, it's I lived in Dallas for a while, so there's that feel of the Cowboys. What's the difference between like the general fans at the Chiefs and the Cowboys in their cities?
Again, when I covered the Chiefs, they were terrible. And they'd go to training camp at William Jewell. And there may be 20 people on the hill watching practice Chiefs at William Jewell. My first camp in Dallas with the Cowboys was in Austin. And they were drawing 11,000, 12,000 fans a day. They had a souvenir tent, they had a freshman tent. It was a circus. Whereas there was really no interest in the Chiefs in training camp. The interest picked up when the season started, and then they started losing and the interest cooled. Cowboys, win or lose, there's always interest. There's a craving for anything you can write about the Cowboys. You give them any kind of insight. So that's a big difference. The Cowboys, I've been to all the other cities. The Cowboys are unlike any other. I think the Steelers and Packers may be close, the Raiders. But the Cowboys, win, lose, or draw, everybody cares about the Cowboys. That's why they're, quote unquote, America's team.
Right. And speaking of America's team and getting into, this is beyond the moniker of America's team, but I saw in your Swan Song article where you said, I got to know Jerry Jones and the Triplets before they were Jerry Jones and the Triplets. I mean, why did you make that as a comment in your article?
Well, because everybody knows those owners and players as Hall of Fame guys. I went to cover them. They're coming off a 1-15 season. They were terrible. They were trying to figure out if they could be a good football team. And they were friendly and cordial and didn't realize what was in their future. So I was able to talk to all those guys anytime I wanted. They were always available to me. They were always good to me. And the bigger they got, the tougher it was to get interviews with them, especially when they started winning Super Bowls. So it was neat to develop relationships with Jones and Aikman and Jimmy and all those guys before they won. Because if you try to jump on the bandwagon after they won, you're easily discardable. But they knew I was there from the start. I was there from the losing. And to this day, I'm friends with most of those people.
What was it that made the Triplets in your mind become the Triplets, or really the Cowboys, and why did they have such a prolonged success?
Well, they're all high draft picks for one. Troy Aikman was the first pick of the draft. Emmitt Smith was the 17th pick, and he believes he should have been the first or second pick. Michael Irvin was in the top 12. But there was elite talent coming in. I think Aikman fed off Smith. Smith fed off Aikman. Aikman is one of the handful of the most accurate passers in NFL history. They didn't throw that much, but when they did throw, it was a big-time offense with Jay Novacek and Michael Irvin, Alvin Harper on the other side. I think had the best offensive line in football, one of the great offensive lines in the history of the game, which really helped Emmitt, which really helped Troy. In '92, when they won the whole thing, they were the youngest, fastest, deepest, best team of football. I think that '92 team could have played with just about any team in the history of the game. They were great young players just entering their primes. And had Jimmy stayed, I think they might have won 4 or 5 Super Bowls. That's just the sad thing. Jimmy left. The Eagles couldn't keep both those guys happy in the same building, Jerry and Jimmy. And had Jimmy stayed and found a way to get along with the owner, I think they might have won 4 or 5, been maybe the greatest dynasty in NFL history.
So what we talk about, like the whole Brady's and the Belichick's nowadays, you think that would have been back then even more, maybe?
That team was built before the salary cap. I think what Belichick's done is amazing. Keep that team as consequential as it's been, with a continuous flow of players on and off the roster. When the Cowboys were winning those Super Bowls, that was a fairly constant roster. They in '94, free agency arrived and they started taking some hits. But in '92, '93, that was virtually the same team, and they were again just entering their primes. When Jimmy left, they went to the NFC title game in '94, but they had taken some hits. Ken Norton left, went to the 49ers, in fact, and beat them. They took some more hits in 1995. They still won it. Again, the Triplets were just playing on a different level. But the salary cap rate took so many hits. By 1996, they were a shell of themselves. And in '95, in fact, was the last time they got to an NFC title game. So it's been a long drought. The salary cap, you can't have bad drafts, and they had about a decade worth of bad drafts. They've kind of fixed it now, and they're back in the mix. But it was a rough decade from about 98 to about 2007 or 8. It was a rough go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really feel bad for him at all. I mean, you can probably see the cup that's in here. You mentioned coming from Detroit, and the fans of this show know I'm a diehard Lions fan. And every time I hear about the whole Cowboys and the offensive line and Emmitt Smith, of course, my biasness says, yeah, what about Barry Sanders if he would have had that line? And I mean, what was it like covering, going back to my biasness, Barry Sanders from an opposition standpoint, even though you grew up in that area?
Very special. I think he's one of the 3 best running backs in history. He passes the eye test. I go back, there was a Monday night game, Dallas and Detroit. I think it might have been '94 in Dallas. I think that's the one game Emmitt Smith or Barry Sanders really wanted to show who's the best back in the league. I think he rushed for 200 yards, and the Lions beat the Cowboys, a good Cowboy team, in overtime. That's the one time I really thought Barry said, something? I'm the best back in football, not Emmitt Smith.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's records, then there's the eye test. And speaking of eye test, I saw also that you were considered one of the, I don't know what word you want to use, gurus or the NFL draft specialist that everybody would come to. How did that genesis happen? And then what would you say was like the most intriguing things you felt throughout your NFL draft process?
Well, it wasn't the eye test with me because I didn't watch any tape. If I was a sports writer, I wasn't a scout. If I was a scout, I'd watch tape. I'm a sports writer. what happened was during the time I was the NFL writer for the morning news, I went to the different teams, different games, different stadiums each week, and got to know everybody. Got to know the GMs, head coaches, players, assistant coaches on other teams. And then when Dave Smith made me the NFL writer in 1992, he said, "Look, I want you to grade drafts." And I said, "Well, if I'm going to grade drafts, I don't know what I'm talking about." So I started calling around to personnel people that actually watch tape, and started getting opinions on players. And I started putting together my own draft board based on the opinions of the talent evaluators. And it got over the years, I had a list of 130 people I was talking from different teams. I talked to everybody. I talked to people in every building. And a lot of people thought I was the consensus draft board. I was the one guy that talked to everybody. And they looked at my top 100 board, and they looked at my mocks, because they figured that's pretty accurate, because he's getting that this isn't his opinion. This is the opinions of NFL people. So I got to a point where NFL people wanted to talk to me. I would get calls the night before the draft from head coaches and GMs wanting to know my mock draft, who was going where. I got calls. I got calls from teams on the clock asking if they missed something on a player before they took them. My boards, I would go, when I talked to head coaches or GMs, I would take about an hour and a half to go through the board. I go through the top 15 players at each position, and it was an extensive conversation. And you do that with 100 people over the course of 3 months. You get a pretty accurate draft board. And I had, in 10 years in a row, I had the best top 100 board in the country. And I had 3 times from 2000, I had the best mock draft. 3 times in 11 years, I stopped doing it in 2012. So stuff was accurate, and the NFL people appreciated my input. And my deal was, if you share with me, I'll share with you. And, you've probably heard the story about the Patriots when they asked Belichick what he saw in Julian Edelman. He credited me for putting him on. And I remember talking to Belichick and said he ran see what this kid's quarterback from Kent State ran. He's not, because they hadn't been at the workout. As he ran like a 4.3, as he's not going to be a quarterback, he's a pretty good athlete. And then Belichick got on him. So it was give and take. They gave me a lot of things, and sometimes I gave something back.
That's actually the first time I did hear that story. That's unique to, like you said, that all these different coaches and GMs, and they're talking to this one centralized guy that isn't even directly involved with any of the team's draft process. I mean, like you said, you fall into that because you were just covering one time, and then you just grew from there, or was it something that you wanted to do personally?
No, you really expose yourself. You start grading drafts. Like I said, you got to know what you're talking about. So, the first year I probably talked to 50 or 60 people. And then the next year was 60 or 70, next year 70 or 80. And then over the course of 20 years, you're talking to everybody. You're talking to 130 people. People that I weren't talking to, I wasn't talking to, would call me and want to talk to me. They want to know. They want to go through the board with me. So the stuff was pretty accurate. I didn't miss. If I missed, I didn't miss big, because by and large, it was a consensus board. It was 32 teams with a consensus.
So do you still do any of that today, or is that you're kind of beyond that?
No, I'm beyond that. When the Morning News made me a columnist in 2012, and I said, look, I'll still do the draft if you take me down to one column a week. And they said, no, don't worry about the draft. You just do the column. And I said, okay, beware. Don't come to me in a year and say you want me to do the draft. If I'm going to let go of this network of 130 people, I'm not going to try to resurrect it. So no, it was too much work. If I wasn't going to do it for fun, because you start at 6 a.m. and sometimes you go to 2 p.m. You don't sleep. And this is for 3 months leading up to the draft. When I was talking to everybody, I'm on their clock. People would call me when they got done with the draft meetings at 1 o'clock in the morning. I get some personnel guys before they went into the meetings at 5:30 in the morning. So you're up, 19, 20 hours a day working the draft board. So it was time to get a life. So when he made me a columnist, I opted to have a life.
Yeah, I saw something else too that I don't know how long ago this really was, but the Monday morning quarterback, you had the all-time draft. How long ago did you guys do that?
About 2 years ago. Peter called me up, and they were trying to get some, historian type people to draft teams over the decades. And he knew my history. I'm a Hall of Fame. They steer people to me for some historical perspective. And he said, "Why don't you mind me involved?" So I got involved, and it was a fun exercise. I tried to draft a true team with left tackle, right tackle, strong side end, weak side end, strong safety, weak safety. And I didn't want to have just a bunch of names. I wanted to put 22 players out there who could actually line up and play in a game. And I thought, I had the second pick of the draft. I took Johnny Unitas. I got Dick Butkus. I got Deacon Jones. I got Jack Ham, Bobby Bell. I had a great set of linebackers. It was a lot of fun. I had a very good team. Very happy with my team.
It looked like there's some other cool things on the website, which I will leave links in the show notes for the fans of the show to go and look at your roster, as well as some of the other kind of cool features that they had on there. And was it like we do fantasy football draft nowadays where it's like a boom, boom, boom pick, or was it a long form? It took you a while to create the whole team as a group?
No, we didn't have Zoom, but we were on a conference call.
Oh, okay.
And they said, okay, this is your pick. It took a couple hours. So I think they gave us maybe a minute to make the pick or 45 seconds to make the pick. And I had my boards in front of me. It was easy to figure out. It was fun. Ron Wolf was there. A lot of great football people were on that call. And it was fun looking at how they drafted players and what they placed a premium on. I wanted Unitas and I wanted to build a defense. And then I built an offense that would be pass oriented. I got Michael Irvin. I got Antonio Gates. I took two running backs who were great pass catchers, LaDainian Tomlinson and Roger Craig. It was Lance Allworth. It was. I would love to line up with this team with Johnny Unitas and those weapons in that defense. I think I could have beaten anybody with that team. It was fun. It was a fun process.
Yeah, it seemed like it would have been a very unique process. Did they have like certain ground rules or anything like that? Because comparing like the players and the eras and things like that.
No, if you want to take Don Hudson in the first round, you took Don Hudson in the first round. If you wanted to take Brett Favre in the first round, if you wanted to take Aaron Rodgers, or if Patrick Mahomes was there, you could have taken him. It was anybody. Just build a team off of 100 years of football, and that was the fun part. I took some guys out of the 50s, and the 60s was my favorite all-time decade. I was a kid. I was watching football then. I was in love with football in the 60s, so I hit a lineup that did favor the 1960s.
Well, yeah, I mean, we fall back to what we know growing up or what we love. And
Sure.
Just like in fantasy football, too, it's like if you're picking between this player or this person, you're going to go with your heart. And you kind of alluded to it earlier, being in the Hall of Fame and Hall of Fame voter. How long have you been a voter?
It's my 25th year. I did it for a stretch in Kansas City, late 80s, early 90s. Then I got to Dallas and I was already a voter. And then I got back on the board about 2000. And I've been on the senior committee since 2004. And when they established a contributor committee in 2015, they put me on that. So I think I'm the only guy that's on all the voting panels.
Yeah, contributor committee. Today is kind of a special day. Who did we put on there this year?
Well, for the first time ever, they picked a scout. They took Bill Nunn of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And this was really a great pick. The history on Bill Nunn is he was a sports editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, which is one of the most prominent African-American newspapers back in the 50s and 60s. And he was a sports editor, and he would go around and cover college football games of the black colleges. And at the end of the year, he'd put together an HBCU, historically black university and colleges all-America team. And a lot of these players, Deacon Jones is on that team, and Roosevelt Brown, and he had a pretty good history of finding good players. So he's picking these teams and Steelers. Some guy's a pretty good source. So in 67, they hired him as a part-time scout. He was going to all the best HBCU games. So he became a part-time scout in 67, and then in 1969, he went full-time. And he's the reason they tapped into the HBCU in the 1970s decade, getting a John Stallworth and a Dwight White and an Ernie Holmes and a Mel Blount and a Donnie Shell. He's the guy that steered the Steelers to those players. And Mel Blount said, "Hey, if it wasn't for Bill Nunn, there would have been a Steelers in the 1970s." So if you're going to put in a first scout, this guy was a definite impact player as an evaluator, and he's a big part of the reason the Steelers were the team of the 1970s decade. So certainly, probably the most deserving candidate on that slate today.
You say deserving candidate. Let's take us inside the head of Rick Gosselin, and when you are, I don't know how you say, but yay or nay when you're voting for if you're going to put a player into the next level or even into the Hall? Like, what goes in your head to determine this is a Hall of Fame player or contributor or coach?
Well, we meet. I wasn't in the contributing meeting today, but I was there last week for the senior meeting and the coach meeting. And we spend a couple hours discussing every candidate. And we have a couple consultants, Hall of Fame consultants, that come in and give us their opinions. And then the consultants leave the room, and then we vote. And it's a secret vote. Usually put it on paper, and they add it up. And then they say, okay, here's the cut. Cut from 12 to 6, 6 to 3, 3 to 2, and then 2 to 1. You get the one guy. So you figured out, you go in with a list, how you think they should be prioritized. And sometimes your top guy gets knocked out. There's only 5 of us in a room. There's 9 in the committee, 5 of us in a room, and 3 votes put you in. This year we picked Drew Pearson, and I thought that was a solid pick. I think that was righting a wrong. I thought Pearson should have been in on the Centennial class. He was first team all-decade wide receiver. From 1930 through 2010, there have been 17 first-team all-decade wide receivers. 16 of them are in the Hall. And Drew Pearson not only is not in the Hall, he'd never been discussed. When we discuss him in February, it'll be the first time he's ever been a finalist. And if you're a first-team all-decade player, that's generally a rubber stamp. The 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were 57 all-decade players, offense, defense. 56 are in the Hall of Fame. Drew Pearson's the one guy who was not. And you wonder, what did Drew Pearson say or do, or how did it happen that he was never a finalist? It was a wrong that needed to be righted. He was a big play, clutch receiver. When the NFL Films did a film of a program of the 75 greatest catches in NFL history in 1994 to honor the 75th anniversary of the game, Drew Pearson had 3 of them. He had the Hail Mary at an 83-yarder against the Rams, and he had that 50-yarder against the Redskins on Thanksgiving. And this guy made big plays. He went across the middle. And they say, well, look at his numbers. His numbers don't compare with Randy Moss or Chris Carter. He had fewer than 500 career catches. But understand, he led the NFC in receiving in 1976 with 58 catches. 50 catches back then was a great season. Now it's 100 catches, a great season. But back then, during that era, he was a dominant receiver with quality to go with the quantity of catches. So I thought that was overdue. Tom Flores, a lot of people thought he would go in the Centennial Committee. He'd been a finalist in years past in the Hall, in the regular process. And it's probably unfinished business there, too. He's one of the handful of coaches that won 2 Super Bowls that wasn't in. And again, it's probably unfinished business as well. When I talk about the eye test, the first thing I look at for a receiver is average yards per catch. What did you do after you caught the ball? The next thing I look at is touchdowns. A lot of guys catch 1 million balls and average 11 yards a catch and don't get in the end zone. I want to know, what did you do after the catch? He benefited playing with Roger Staubach. Staubach put the ball in positions where he couldn't make plays after the catch. But this guy, he made plays. He made long touchdowns. He did things after the catch. The reception didn't end the play. He did something with the ball. And that's when I talk about quality. That's what I mean. He had, for his time, quantity, but the quality screamed out.
So if you were to have to say, it's kind of, one thing that I've heard too is like, you'd measure on Super Bowl rings, championships. If a player is not on a championship team, they're on a horrible team the whole time, but they're still head and shoulders above. How much of a factor does that even weigh in individual performance versus, say, team performance?
Well, over 60% of everybody in Canton won a championship. I mean, if you won a title, you have a distinct advantage in the room. If you played offense and won a title, you have a bigger advantage. Defensive players have a tougher time in. I don't think it's quite 2-1 anymore, offense and defense, but it's tougher for defensive players to get in. If you're a defensive player that didn't win a championship, a guy like Randy Gradishar, you stand on the doorstep for years and years and years. If you're an offensive lineman that didn't win a championship with no stats, you're on the doorstep. You can't get in. The classic case is George Coons. George Coons was an 8-time Pro Bowler. He went to more Pro Bowls in the 1970 decade than the 4 all-decade tackles. And yet George Coons has never been discussed. And he was an elite player at Notre Dame, second pick of the draft. He went to the Pro Bowl as a rookie. Suffered a knee injury his second year. After 9 games, didn't make the Pro Bowl, comes back, goes to 7 straight Pro Bowls. He's traded by the Falcons to the Colts for the right to take Steve Bartkowski with the first overall pick. He's captain of the Falcons in his second season, captain of the Colts in his first season. First year in the AFC, he's captain of the AFC Pro Bowl team. He plays 11 seasons. 3 of them have injuries, but every time he was healthy, he went to 8 Pro Bowls. And here's a guy who's never been discussed because 1, he didn't win a championship. 2, he had no stats. And the process is flawed from that context. There's got to be a better way of judging players that didn't win championships. And that's, I'm not sure how you go about doing it, but now I've tried to make an effort to resurrect guys that good players, great players, Hall of Fame worthy players that have been forgotten because of lack of championships. And we've got a number of them in.
Yeah, and that's something that you have on your website, Talk of Fame. State Your Case, for instance. Can you explain to me what State Your Case is and why you started it?
Yeah, when we started our Talk of Fame network, we had a radio show. We had a national radio show, and we had that up and running for 5 years. And a lot of the things we did on the website, we carried over to the radio, and the radio we carried over to the website. But when we first started it, we were going to be a Hall of Fame themed website. We said, let's analyze players not in the Hall of Fame and state their case. Why these people deserve to be discussed. Why does these people deserve to be considered? We're not saying they're all Hall of Famers, but we're saying they had careers that deserved discussion. We've done, this week, we did our 302nd State Your Case. There have been about, I think, 30 to 35 of them have since been enshrined. But there are a lot of guys that deserve discussion and never will get it. If nothing else, they got the discussion in the story, in the State Your Case. And they're read, they're really widely read, and we get a lot of feedback on them. And you wonder why. Why aren't guys in the Hall of Fame? I did one on the guy who founded the NFL, Ralph Hay. He's the guy who had the Canton Auto dealership, and he owned the Canton Bulldogs, and he won 3 titles, but he wasn't making any money. No one was. So he called the different teams from different leagues in the Midwest and said, come meet me at my dealership. And he said, look, we're better off together than we are separately. Why don't we band together and become a league? And that became the NFL. And Ralph Hay has never been discussed as a Hall of Fame finalist. Without Ralph Hay, the Hall of Fame's not in Canton. And who knows when the NFL would have been formed had it not been Ralph Hay. And they wanted Hay to be commissioner. And he said, no, we need more of a high profile guy. So he recommended Jim Thorpe, and Jim Thorpe was the commissioner. Ralph Hay should be in the Hall of Fame. I think to have I think we put up 12 contributors. I'm not sure there are 12 contributors more worthy than the guy who founded the league. So I would hope that in the next 3 years, Ralph Hay gets a hearing.
Well, in a little bit less than a month, we have the 100th birthday, so I wonder if that'll spark some more interest in everything as far as the name going out there. I had not myself heard of the name until I started my own show, and then probably the 3rd maybe episode was Ralph Hay episode, something like that. It was Walter Camp. I can't remember how it goes now. It's been 2.5 years
Grange,
ago.
Jim Thorpe, one of those guys.
I know I had Red Grange in there, obviously, but it was like Walter Camp, and then it might have even been Walter Camp, then Ralph Hay, or maybe the founding. And of course, I talked about Ralph Hay, but yeah, he was in the top 2 or 3 episodes that I had, and those were solo episodes back in the day. You're pretty passionate about various State Your Cases, but if I told you right now, here's the golden ticket, you can only pick one of your State Your Cases, what player, contributor, coach would you? Boom, you're inducted in the Hall of Fame right now.
Well, if I had to take a tribute, it would be Ralph Hay. The guy founded the league to take care of some unfinished business. Player-wise, in the senior committee, I do think that George Coons is a guy that deserves a longer look. I think we really need to put in a Cincinnati Bengal. We've discussed the 2 Kens, Ken Anderson, Ken Riley. Now, that we have been the senior committee's been around for 50 years, and we've picked 70 candidates. And we have never picked a Colt, a Charger, a Bengal, or a Falcon. And we've had 7 or 8 players picked for some teams. The Cowboys have had 4 since 2004. The Raiders have had 4 since 2004. And we haven't picked a Bengal. This is a team that went to 2 Super Bowls. This is a team that's been shortchanged. Tommy Nobis, he'd be a guy that I'd like to see come out. Randy Gradishar, again, a defensive player, didn't win a championship. Again, George Coons, Colts, no player. The two Kens, Riley or Anderson. I would really hope that we bring out one of the 2 Kens next year. We need to bring out a Bengal. There's 2 very worthy Bengals. The Ken Riley thing it boggles my mind. 65 career interceptions, second among peer corners. And he's never been discussed. He's 5th all time, tied with Charles Woodson. And Charles Woodson's probably going to be a first ballot guy come February. And we've never discussed Ken Riley. The Pro Football Hall of Fame is not supposed to be about reputation. It's supposed to be about production. He's the second most productive cornerback in the history of the game, and he's never been a finalist. He led the AFC in interceptions 3 times. He intercepted 9 passes in his final season at 36 years of age and didn't make the Pro Bowl. I mean, how do you explain it? The other guy across the way, Lamar Parrish, his teammate, he was gone, but he was also a punt returner. Back in the day, they didn't pick specific kick and punt returners. So Lamar had the punt return skills. He was getting voted in every year. He went to 8 Pro Bowls. Ken Riley went to none. We need to discuss Ken Riley. And if not Ken Riley, Ken Anderson. Best quarterback not in Canton right now, Ken Anderson.
Yeah, on one of my other shows on the network, Pigskin Past, 2 episodes ago, that was his it was John Zook and Ken Riley, because they had passed away on the same day. And he, in his mind, Joe Zagorski, it was a travesty. And Ken Riley was the one that, when I did the more research, I was like, how does the 5th most interceptions in the league, back when they only played 14 games for most of his career even, and how is he not even considered? It baffled my mind as well. Granted, there's a longevity factor there, I guess, so it was spread out. But still, what did you say, 65 interceptions in his career?
Right. And the problem is no Pro Bowls. He played 15 years, no Pro Bowls. And like I said, he 3 times he led the AFC in interception and never went to the Pro Bowl. How do you intercept 9 passes and not go to the Pro Bowl? It boggles my mind. But I think the lack of Pro Bowls is what's kept him out, and that's wrong. So this is not about reputation. It's about production. Ken Riley, outside of Night Train Lane, there wasn't a more productive defensive back in the game. He deserves to be discussed, and the sooner the better.
And you keep bringing up, of course, we talk about senior class and the ones that are eligible for what we call the modern era. At what point are the rules when they break away from not being able to become modern era and they break into that senior class role?
You have a 25-year window of eligibility. You're ineligible for the first 5 years, and essentially you've got 20 years to get in. And I think one of the problems is once a guy gets into the room, they like to say that 94% of the guys that get in the room get in the Hall of Fame. Well, that's because once they get in the room, they generally never leave the room. Lynn Swann and John Stallworth were there for like 12 consecutive years. That's 24 other players we didn't talk about while we were talking about Swann and Stallworth. Harry Carson, Art Monk, there's some guys that have been in that queue a long time. And we talked about them every year. We didn't get to talk about other people. I think we need to cycle more people through that room. I've got a list of 80 seniors I think need to be discussed. And there are 50-some all-decade players in the senior pool, and most have never been discussed. If you're picked all-decade, one of the best players of your era, you deserve to have your career discussed at some point by some Hall of Fame committee. And too many great players have slid through the cracks. Now, I was talking to Ron Borges, one of my cohorts at Talk of Fame Network. You look at Cornelius Bennett was a two-time Defensive Player of the Year. He's never been discussed. Wilbur Marshall was as good a linebacker as there was in the 1980s. He's never been discussed. How did these guys slide through the cracks? We need to cycle more people. If I could fix one thing, it'd be cycle more people through the room. If we could discuss 25 instead of 15, I'd be all for that. We need to discuss people and get the right people in the Hall of Fame.
And how does that process even work? You said, can we discuss 25 versus 15? Is it who promotes up to get these 25 versus 15? Okay,
we get a preliminary list of candidates, and there are probably 150 names. And then we might add some names. I've added a name. I suggest that they put Bubba Baker in the mix. And then we get this list of essentially the ballot, and we're supposed to vote that list of 150 30 down to 15. And there are 48 members on the panel. We all vote. The top 15 vote getters become the finalists. And then when we have our meeting the day before the Super Bowl. That's the only 15 we can talk about. We can't talk about Ken Riley. We can't talk about Cornelius Bennett. We can only talk about the 15. And then we have various cuts, 15 to 10, 10 to 5, 5, that, and then it becomes a yes or no, up or down on the 5. But you got to make cuts. You got to make cuts. We initially cut the preliminary list to 25, and then we cut that 25 down to 15. And then we take that 15 into the room the day before the Super Bowl. And that's what we discussed. We come up with the 5, quote unquote, most deserving candidates.
I mean, not to sound, what's the bet? But if adding 10 more to the list of already growing, would that really, if there are already 5 that should be higher, would that really help, you think, if you add the 10? Or is it just to get their name in consideration?
It's to discuss more people. What I would like to see is have a second meeting in June. Have us all go to Canton. It's a non-voting meeting. Let's talk about everybody. If you want to talk about 15 players, bring them. Spend 2 days discussing everybody. You know something? This is the guy who we should be talking about. But we never get together as a group until that one day, meeting in February. And I do think we should go through we should vet the candidates. We should do a better job of deciding who should be discussed and who shouldn't. But that's cost prohibitive. I mean, the hall's not going to pay 48 people a can for 2 days to do this. But if you want to do it right, that's what I would do.
Well, I'm thinking that in a post-COVID era, we're kind of proven that people are able to use Zoom calls for massive gatherings. So that takes that cost prohibitive thing and just throws that out the window. So maybe there's some opportunities there.
Yeah, we did the Zoom calls for the senior, the contributor, and the coaching selections. That's the first time we did it. I was really surprised how smoothly it went. Remember, the meeting was generally quicker than it had been when we were all together.
Yeah, because I can press mute on you right now if I.
Yeah, the issue is though. I mean, having 48 guys in a Zoom call, that may be a bit chaotic. I could see as many as even 20. I could deal with. I think the NFL had Zoom calls, player calls with position groups with numbers like that. 48 would be kind of unwieldy. We couldn't detect anybody on the screen. Be little dots.
It'd be challenging, but I think that again, as we are now in this COVID, as we get past that, and it's becoming more feasible, and like there's so many people working from home now where they thought, oh, that's impossible, and then now it's like maybe it's not impossible. So I think that as you continue in technology, and really more, it's probably the acceptance maybe that people could get to it. Because I'm with you, that should be discussed more. How could you expect in one meeting to talk about whittle it down from 150 to 15 and then just talk about it there? I don't think that's not doing justice to the people that still could be deserved to get in there.
Yeah, and if there was a second meeting, I don't think you'd see this many people falling through the cracks. If they're not getting a hearing in February, they're going to get a hearing in June and July. And guys, a guy like George Coons who goes to 8 Pro Bowls, there's only a small handful of guys who went to that many Pro Bowls that aren't in the Hall of Fame. A guy like George Coons really needs to be discussed. Randy Granishar went to 7 Pro Bowls. Had he won a championship, he'd probably already be in. The championship's really way heavy, and I think if you're a defensive player that didn't win titles or an offensive lineman that didn't win titles, you're a long shot at best.
Especially before they had the sack as the official record for the defensive lineman and everything. Let's go back to 1973, though, on your typewriter. I know you mentioned that.
It was a typewriter. You're right about that. It was not telling.
What was the difference, you think, as far as being a writer in the 70s versus then growing into your 90s and what they are now? What's the difference between that type of a reporter versus today?
There's no talk radio. I mean, you go in the open locker room, there may be 3 or 4 writers, and that was it. You had the whole rock room yourself. You go in the Cowboys locker room now with all the talk radio and all the national, they're 100 media. Back in the 70s, 80s, even a bit into the 90s, you can get a one-on-one with players. Now it's virtually impossible. And now with COVID, I think the the era of the one-on-one interviews is pretty much over. You're not going to get that kind of time. I don't know that if I could have done the job the way I did it in today's climate. I got to know assistant coaches. In today's game, they don't want you talking to the assistant coaches. They don't want you talking to the players. They want to know what questions you're going to ask. And when I was covering the Chiefs, and they were so bad, I had open run of the building. I could go into the trainer's room. I used to walk down the head coach's office in the morning, pour myself a cup of coffee from his coffee maker as he's watching tape. And now, you have key entry. You can't. You're stuck in that one little press room. There's no casual contact. When I was covering the Cowboys, I could walk the halls of Valley Ranch. I'd bump into Jimmy or one of the assistant coaches, or even Jerry. You talk, small talk, and ask questions. That doesn't happen now. The Cowboys now, the coaches are in one part of the building, and the management, the ownership's in another, and the media's in another, and you're just so isolated. I miss the one-on-one contact that I had in the 70s and 80s and 90s as I was, building my reputation as a writer.
Yeah, I used to live really close to the Star down there, so I drove by it every day on the way to work when they were building it. That thing's, I'll say impressive. Maybe that's the word. I don't know. From an outsider's perspective, did you ever go there in there? Or?
Yeah, we taped for the last couple of years. We've taped a TV show over there every Wednesday during the season. I always thought that they would move the NFL Combine there because, in addition to the practice facility, the Cowboys' home base, they've got an indoor field that sees 18,000, which several high schools play at. There is a hotel, an Omni Hotel attached. There's a Baylor Medical Center attached. You could do everything there that you do in Indianapolis in a much more compact setting. The only difference is the hotels. You wouldn't be able to put everybody in the one hotel. There's a bit of a contract there. In Indianapolis, you can walk. You can stay at any hotel and walk to the dome. But I thought if they were going to move the Combine out of Indianapolis, Dallas would be the place.
Yeah, it's definitely a world-class deal. And you mentioned how you don't know how people could do it nowadays. If you were to able to give somebody, like, go back to the 1973, you're looking over yourself in the typewriter, over 48 years, what advice would you have given your younger self at that point in time with everything that you know now?
Well, it's all about relationships. It's about developing relationships and developing a trust with the people you're dealing with, having integrity. There's some things you hear that may be off the record, and you keep it off the record. You may benefit with it down the road, but you develop a trust. And I think I developed a trust with the people, and the draft was a pretty good indication. When people told me things during the draft that you're not going to hear, you hear all positives, all negatives on players. It's because people trust me. They know I wouldn't burn them. To this day, no one knew who I was talking to. They all knew I was talking to everybody, but they couldn't identify a single person. I never exposed who was in my network. Again, it's about the relationships. And if you have good relationships and you have their trust, they will tell you things. Assistant coaches taught me the game. When I was covering the Chiefs, they were so bad. I'd sit down. I remember sitting down with Frank Gans, who was as good as it got in special teams. And he had a guy named Albert Lewis, who was one of the best kick blockers I've ever seen. And 10 o'clock in the morning, when they're going through walkthrough, I'm sitting with Frank in his office. He's showing me how he's going to block punts that particular week. He was showing me the weakness of the coverage of the blocking scheme for that particular team and how he's going to expose it with Albert Lewis. I remember they were playing the Jets in a playoff game. And the one playoff game I covered in Kansas City. And Albert Lewis had blocked like 7 punts that year. And I was talking to Larry Pasquale, the Jets special teams coach, the week of the game. And he said, look, I can't tell you how this game's going to play out, but I guarantee you one thing. Albert Lewis will not block a punt. Albert Lewis blocked the punt, caught it in midair, and scored a touchdown with it. Gans would show me how he was going to do it. Still one of the most remarkable games I've ever seen. 1986. Chiefs need to win in Pittsburgh in the season finale to get in the playoffs. They have the worst offense in football, 28th of 28 teams. Their backup quarterback is playing. Bill Kenny's hurt. Todd Blackledge has got to play. That day, the Chiefs had 6 first downs and like 120 yards of total offense. They won the game 24-21. They blocked a punt for a touchdown. They blocked a field goal for a touchdown. They returned a kickoff for a touchdown. And Nick Lowry had a field goal. All the points were on special teams. No offense. That's when I realized, you know something? You can win games with special teams. For the last 30-some years, I've ranked the special teams. Frank Gans showed me his formula. And I've taken that and I've added various categories. Now I've got the gold standard ranking for special teams. I rank all 32 teams each year. And it's amazing how often the Super Bowl champion winds up in the top 10 somewhere. I did a composite. Last 10 years, the number one special teams in the league was New England. Over the last 20 years, composite, the number one special teams was New England. There's a reason they win championships. He's got Tom Brady. He's an expert in defense, but he doesn't leave any stone unturned on special teams. So again, Gans gave me an appreciation because I was able to sit with Frank Gans and watch him. He taught me special teams, and that's what you're not going to find today. It's very difficult to have access to assistant coaches. You're not going to get that sit down for an hour and let's watch tape together type relationship that I have with Frank.
Yeah, that's one of those moments that you just can't really replicate. And speaking of moments that you can't really replicate, something I always ask the listeners of the show or the guests of the show, I'm going to give you the virtual keys to my DeLorean. You can go back in time any point in NFL history. You can't change the outcome. You can talk to one person or you can watch one game. You can ask them a question. Where you going and who you asking?
Well, I lived that experience. When I was covering the NFL, the first year, the Ravens were in Baltimore. I was covering a game, and they take you down on the field with about 2 minutes to go for the end of the game. So I'm on the field, and I'm standing next to John Unitas as the Ravens are running a 2-minute drill. Talking to John Unitas, who was the king of the 2-minute drill. I mean, in football, you can't beat that. You can't beat that. I would have liked to have talked to Paul Brown. I never had a one-on-one with Paul Brown. I've had one-on-ones with Shula and Belichick and a lot of the great coaches. I would have loved to have talked to Paul Brown. I think he is the reason pro football got to where it was. The weight training and the playbook and the franchise quarterback deal with Otto Graham. I would have liked to talk to him. I would like to have a more in-depth conversation with John Unitas, what he saw. And I still think he's the best quarterback that's ever played the game. He calls his own plays. He beat you mentally. He beat you physically. He was, in my mind, he was the best. And if you put John Unitas in today's game, he may never throw an incomplete pass. He was that good. If you take these guys, the Brees, the Rodgers, and Brady's, and put them back in the 1960s when you could hit the quarterback and you could break his nose, you wouldn't be seeing these 5,000-yard passing seasons from those guys. It's all about the era. But John Unitas and Paul Brown would be the two guys that I would love to talk to.
There you go. Paul Brown, Johnny Unitas. You could probably do worse for legendary men of the gridiron if you had to go back and talk to somebody, huh? And I hope you enjoyed this insider's look into a 47-year career with Rick Gosselin, covering the NFL from many different angles. You can learn more about Rick and the topics that we covered by heading to sportshistorynetwork.com. And to give you a little bit of a teaser bomb, we talked about the travesty of Ken Riley not being in the Hall of Fame. Next week, we continue this discussion with Ken Riley's son, Ken Riley II. But for now, dudes, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.